Good afternoon and welcome to the Boring Millionaire podcast. In today's segment, School of Stock, I want to discuss what is the S&P 500 and what is the Nasdaq Composite. They're two very important things when you're investing in the stock market. So we'll start with the S&P 500. What that is a grouping of the 500 best performing stocks on the public stock exchange, and they're grouped together to create a measuring tool for the stock market's performance as a whole. Now with that, how would you determine what are the 500 best companies? Well, there's a special committee and they look at things like profitability, how many of the shares are open to the public to invest in, what's their market cap, how valuable is their company, and they look at this criteria to determine what the 500 best companies are. So then within that, when they discover exactly what 500 they want to use for this grouping, they put them into a grouping so then we could have a benchmark to look at when we want to know how the stock market is performing overall. Now, the same thing could be said about the Nasdaq Composite, although the Nasdaq Composite is a little bit bigger than that. The Nasdaq itself is an exchange. So when companies want to list and go public, they either list it on the Nasdaq exchange or the US Stock Exchange. The US Stock Exchange, or the NYSE, is a little outdated and becoming more of a thing of the past, with more and more companies listing on the Nasdaq itself. So there's over 7,000 companies on the public stock exchange just on the Nasdaq alone. And then within that, they take the composite and group together the 3,000 best companies on that exchange. So a lot more than 500, but I like that because it gives a much wider horizon of what we're looking at as a market as a whole. Now, I do like the S&P 500 because it's a little more particular. These companies are leading the world and they are innovative in the world that we live in. But when you look at the Nasdaq Composite, it is a wider blanket of how the market is performing. Nonetheless, both of these are used as benchmarks to measure the stock market's performance as a whole. Now, I particularly like to focus more on the S&P 500, and when you watch my other videos, you'll see me referencing the S&P 500 when I discuss where the market is. And even today, we're sitting at 6650 on the S&P. Even today, we're sitting at 6650 on the S&P 500, where we had a record high of 6699 earlier in the afternoon. So right there is an idea of how the S&P 500 is used to determine the performance of the stock market. Right in that example, we're down a little bit today, but earlier we were doing better when we hit an all-time high. So that is the idea behind these two benchmarks, is so that people could look at the stock market as a whole, and they don't need to dig through thousands of stocks, even 500 different stocks, to get an idea of how the market's feeling. So one thing I would like to also include, if you're interested in investing in either of these, you can do so by investing in the UPRO Double Weight ETF or the TQQQ Double Weight ETF. Now, the reason I would bring those up is if you're looking at the S&P 500 and you see it down crazy, which is opportunity in the stock market, you want to buy them when they're low. But if you see the S&P 500 or the Nasdaq down for a week, what you can do is invest in one of these two ETFs, so that way you're investing your money into the general stock market as a whole. That way you don't have to get too particular on what stocks you may or may not want to buy, what may or may not be a good choice at the time. But what you can do is invest in the market as a whole, just like the idea of the benchmarks to begin with. The idea of the S&P 500 or the Nasdaq is to look at the market as a whole. So if you see them down and opportune as a whole, these are two ETFs that get you involved in the market, generally speaking. So with all that said, thank you for tuning in, and I'm always here to answer any questions you may have either about this particularly or the stock market as a whole. So if you want to ask any questions, find me on Facebook, Instagram, or Threads, and you can find all other episodes available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. My mission is to not only make you money in the stock market, but to make sure you feel confident while you're doing it. I want everybody to understand the investment landscape as well as they can, and then only that way can you begin investing in a better financial future for yourself. So thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.